My name is Jenna Wadsworth. I am the Democratic nominee for North Carolina Commissioner of Agriculture. And I grew up on a hog, cow, chicken, corn, cotton, tobacco, and soybean farm on a dirt road in Johnston County. So farming is in my blood. I am still active with farm operations to this day with my father. And this past season, I actually planted over 45 rows of fruits and vegetables. So this is deeply personal to me, running for this office and running to be able to take an industry that's largely been left in the past and move it into the future. For the last 10 years, I've been elected in Wake County as the Soil and Water Conservation District Supervisor, a role that when I was first elected in 2010, we made history when I became the youngest woman ever elected to any political office in the state of North Carolina at the age of 21. And I share that because I really do believe that young people are not just the future. We're capable of making real meaningful change in our communities starting today. And that's something I've been doing for the past decade for the 1.2 million people who call Wake County home. I've been supporting our farmers, helping them be economically profitable, but also move into best management practices that allow them to put conservation first. I co-authored the county's agricultural economic development plan that gave farmers a viable pathway to market. And I also pushed for major investments to be made in environmental education programming in both our public and private schools, because I know that it's our children who have to live with the brunt of our inaction on climate change unless we begin to elect leaders who from day one are unapologetic in their commitment to addressing the climate crisis head on. So now I'm running for Commissioner of Agriculture to fight for our small farmers. There are still over 46,000 farmers in North Carolina. And for those of us that live in the Triangle, it may seem a little bit unbelievable as we see development left and right, but agriculture is still our state's biggest industry and brings in something like $92.7 billion annually to our state's economy while employing over 770,000 individuals from Murphy to Manteo. And I think it's absolutely critical that we have someone sitting in this office leading one of our most important industries who shares our values and priorities and who is committed to ensuring that we can build a more just, sustainable, and equitable future that works for every single person who calls North Carolina home instead of just the select few, which is why I signed a pledge not to take any corporate PAC check money, and also not to take, I'm the only statewide candidate of either party that signed a pledge not to take any money from fossil fuel executives or their PACs, because I believe in living my values. And so this campaign is funded by individuals who primarily live and work and call North Carolina home. And I'm excited to get to talk to y'all about the issues that we're gonna address in this campaign.
So I do want to talk about those issues too, but first I want to ask you about experience, because voters are going to look and say, so you had good service on soil and water, and it's a jump to an agency that has 21 divisions. So talk about how you're equipped to make that jump and why you're equipped to make that jump.
Right, so I've worked very hard the last 10 years serving people who call Wake County home. I don't care what your partisan affiliation is. I think at the end of the day, we all wanted to know that we had access to clean drinking water. We did significant projects in the Jordan and Falls Lake watersheds to do that work, and with our 303D impaired and impacted water systems. Under my tenure in leadership, we secured the first conservation easement that the district has ever held, preserving land quality for the foreseeable future. And we have several now since then, have done a number of environmental education programming at our schools, including putting in outdoor classrooms and community gardens. And, you know, not just this, I know what it is like to have to struggle day in and day out when you don't know what's going to happen with another major storm event, or what seed prices are going to be, or whatever, you know, trade war we're going to be in, from being an actual producer in this industry, from working with contracts and renting out land to other farmers. You know, I understand what that life is like. And not only have I been a member of that industry, but so have generations and generations of my family members. But, you know, I think the other thing is, this is a position where it is past time to see real leadership to address some of these very big issues that we're facing. And I think agriculture and this industry holds the key to addressing issues with climate change, but that means that you actually have to elect someone who believes that climate change is real. It means having the opportunity to address food insecurity. Despite the fact that we're one of the top 10 states in agricultural production, we're also one of the top 10 states in food insecurity. And what's worse is 1 in 5 children in North Carolina don't know where their next meal is coming from. I think that's absolutely criminal in a state that grows so much of the nation's food. And honestly, if my opponent had wanted to address that, he's had 15 years to do so. Not just that, but a lot of our small farmers in particular are worse off now than what they were back then. They have a lack of new market opportunities. You need someone with the vision to be able to say, hey, it's time to look at reforming the discriminatory hemp licensure process. It's time to look at the opportunity that's inherent in the legalization of cannabis. It's time to look at what we could do when we build regenerative and sustainable ag programs and educational programs into our schools and into our communities, and that we connect the dots and work with everyone from agribusiness, from our brewery industry, our vineyard owners, our distilleries, to our restaurants, to talking about people who are also in textiles, because there are a number of agricultural products like hemp that could be used in that industry. There's a number of products like hemp that could be used in aerospace engineering. We're not connecting the dots. We're not giving farmers viable pathways to market. I understand how to craft real policy that actually makes a difference in people's lives. And the person that is sitting in this office, who is leading our state's biggest industry, should be someone who knows how to connect the dots, how to work with folks in different industries, who knows how to put policy together that makes a real tangible difference in folks' lives. That's the reason why I've been endorsed by so many major organizations, so many unions in this state, everyone from our teachers to the AFL-CIO, to the communication workers, to our social workers, because I talk about healthcare and how rural healthcare affects rural communities. It affects food insecurity, it affects nutrition, it affects the ability to be economically viable. Not just that, I've been endorsed by a number of members of the legislature and folks that are running for it, because I know I would have to work with them in order to get other policy passed. And in fact, there were a number of members who called me after, we were hit with this coronavirus pandemic and said, hey, Jenna, we see that farmers are struggling. What can we do? And so they're already looking to me to say, hey, what ideas do you have and how can you make a tangible difference? And as a result of that, what came out of that experience was Senate Bill 776, which would have been this like COVID Small Farmers Relief Act. Now, essentially, I saw a need within the industry as farmers were either seeing major labor shortages, or there were transportation routes that were disrupted, or where their market pipeline and pathway was to either restaurants or schools that were being shut down once COVID started. And I said, hey, how do you take all this food, a lot of it that's just sitting and rotting in fields, and maybe because we've seen double-digit drops on the international commodity market, how do we take all of this product that farmers are creating and producing, allow them to still receive a tax credit or some sort of economic relief for doing so, and let's shore up the distribution pipeline, and let's get that food to where it needs to go. As more and more people are out of work, they're not able to access unemployment. We're seeing record demand at our food banks. And I just want to say too, I really appreciate how many food banks and nonprofit partners stepped up at this time of need, but it's also unfair to ask them to continue operating at that same level and at that same demand when there are programs in place that could make a difference, or there are government leaders that are not creating programs and opportunities to actually take care of the people that they were elected to serve. And so this would have done a number of things. It would have supported our farmers. It would have supported the folks who need help right now. But there were a number of legislative Republicans who couldn't put partisanship aside to allow for us to pass policy that actually made a tangible difference in folks' lives. And I think the last thing I will say in regards to your question, because a lot of times we look at someone who doesn't look like a farmer. I don't look like your typical farmer, but I think that also says that we need to change the way that we think about and look at things. Also, as a young person, as a woman, as a member of the LGBTQ community, folks are regularly questioning my experience. And I think that has more to do with our personal biases and flaws, systemic flaws, than it does to say that, I myself am incredibly capable of doing this job. You can look at the work that I've done the last 10 years. You can look at what I've been talking about on this campaign trail for over a year and a half. You can look at the support that we have generated and garnered from throughout North Carolina. And, I wonder if people would have those same misconceptions if I was sitting here and I was a man. My opponent actually went from being a soil and water conservation district supervisor in a smaller county with less tangible accomplishments to then running statewide and becoming your commissioner of agriculture. So am I experienced? Absolutely. Am I capable? Absolutely. But more importantly, I'm a fighter and my values align with the people of North Carolina.
I appreciate that. And we would have asked the same question of a man who had the experience that you had. But I want to talk about food insecurity because you talked about connecting the dots between farmers and food insecurity. That's something we've talked about as an editorial board. Give us your ideas. How do you do so?
So again, 1 in 5 children are food insecure in North Carolina. I have a number of different plans because I believe in being a woman with a plan to begin to tackle this. So first of all, I would love to see a garden on every school ground. I think that that's an amazing educational opportunity for our children. We've already seen studies that show that them being able to spend time outdoors in nature has positive mental health aspects, but also understanding and learning about nutrition, biology, climate change, and environmental education. This is a really powerful hands-on approach to being able to do so. And like I alluded to earlier, I've been endorsed by the Teachers Union, and I know this is something that they're very, very excited about doing. Moreover, and those community gardens could then be used as a source of food for our children or their families. Additionally, I would love to imagine a world one day without agricultural subsidies. And a way to go about starting to tackle that or make that vision a reality is let's contract with our farmers here in North Carolina to grow more of the food that's going to end up on our children's plate. A lot of times Cisco and these kind of middlemen are the ones who end up distributing food in our food system. A lot of times the food comes from 1,200 to 1,500 miles away. That's also, you see a number of greenhouse gases emitted along the way. Children are getting less adequate nutrition out of that because it's been picked too early or it's been flash frozen. Also, it just doesn't taste as good. You talk about kids not liking to eat their vegetables. Well, of course, if they're getting like a second tier food product, it's not going to taste as good. But let's contract with our farmers. Let's make sure they know that they're being supported by our legislature. They're being supported by North Carolinians. It would also encourage them to move away from monoculture into diversification because monoculture and consolidation are two of the biggest issues facing the industry as a whole right now. And then, we're giving our children a higher quality food product at a time when nutrition is absolutely critical to their long-term career outcomes and their educational outcomes. I would argue that food insecurity, especially amongst our children, is a national security issue because these are the next generation of folks who are going to serve as civil servants. They're going to serve as member of the armed forces, and their brains and their muscles are developing. So the bare minimum that we should be wanting to do is making sure that we're giving them access to high quality nutrition. Now, I also want to advocate and work with leaders on the federal level to reform the SNAP program. So like I was saying earlier, while these food banks are seeing unprecedented demand, Feeding America has done some really great work. But for every one person that Feeding America is feeding, if SNAP was reformed, it could actually feed 9. And so this is just another example of government not working as efficiently and effectively as it could. I also think that we should expand the minimum monthly benefit on the SNAP program and also make sure that all of our farmers markets are accepting SNAP benefits. And it's not just that. Again, when you talk about connecting all the dots, in a lot of these rural places or socioeconomically disadvantaged areas, one of the only places that you are able to buy food or groceries are these Family Dollars, these Dollar Generals that have started popping up all over the place, or corner stores that a lot of times are stocking preservative-laden food that isn't, nutrient rich, that isn't whole food products. And so if you want to talk about tackling food insecurity too, not only do you have to make SNAP benefits, they have to be accepted at our farmers markets, but we have to teach people how to use whole foods and how to cook whole foods effectively. And so, there's a number of pieces we need to do there. We also just need to talk about education in general. And the other thing with food insecurity, again, just because you live next to a farm does not mean that you don't live in a food desert. Again, with monoculture and consolidation, you're seeing folks grow one thing, they're dependent upon whatever is happening with the international commodity market. And that kind of takes me into talking a little bit about consolidation, in this country, we've become accustomed to cheap, quick, and easy when it comes to our food. We don't know the actual value that we should be paying for a gallon of milk or a dozen eggs or a loaf of bread. And in fairness, it'd be really hard to ask most folks to shell out a couple extra dollars for those kitchen staples, because wages have largely been stagnant since the 70s. And so when you're talking about connecting all the dots, this is another thing where, most ag commissioners wouldn't necessarily talk about it, but I am in support of a living wage instead of just a minimum wage. If you want to talk about giving people access to opportunities and the ability to be able to buy produce that not only supports our local farmers, that's farmed in a more sustainable and morally sound sort of way, and keeps money and jobs here in our local communities, but also produce that actually is far more beneficial to their health. And so on that note, we have to strengthen and build more resilient local food systems and move away from just supporting consolidation.
Ned?
And Jenna, the governor considered an executive order to get into these meatpacking plants to do something about COVID. Ag commissioner and the labor commissioner backed off of that. What do you think about the safety and health of these people that are working in these facilities, and what could you do as commissioner to help them?
That's a terrific question. So I want to start by saying that, undocumented workers, these farm workers, absolutely make up the backbone of the agricultural industry. And I believe that the people who pick our food, the people who make this industry work, deserve a moral pathway to citizenship. And while that is federal policy, having an ag commissioner who can advocate for that and who supports that and who sees the humanity in individuals, I think is absolutely critical to changing the culture and changing the narrative. And furthermore, I think that a truly great America would have already addressed the immigration crisis instead of treating it like a pest problem. And when you talk about what's happening with our meatpacking plants, with our undocumented workers, and the bulk of them they're either undocumented or they're here on H-2A visas. They are overworked, they are underpaid, they're working very, very physically intensive jobs. I don't know if you've ever visited a meatpacking plant. I did early on in this campaign and looked at the difference in a small versus a large plant. Sometimes in an hour, you have to slit the throat of 1,000 hogs. And you are in very close contact, close proximity to other workers. A lot of these companies, these big corporations, didn't put up the glass shields between workers early on. They didn't make it so that these folks weren't in close contact with each other. You're also breathing more intensely by virtue of doing this very labor-intensive job. Adequate PPE wasn't provided early on. I know that the governor also signed an executive order trying to help distribute that. In Wake County, we were letting folks and farmers know they could also come to us at the Soil and Water Conservation District to get it, because there was a lot of confusion about where producers would go pick up PPE for their employees or their farm workers. And then, the thing is, these workers in these meatpacking plants, besides for that, there's still migrant camps in North Carolina. A lot of folks don't realize that. And for a number of these employees, the bigger corporate entities bus these workers back and forth. So again, they're in close proximity for another 30 minutes to an hour each way. And on top of that, a lot of their employers are either not offering healthcare, or these workers are too scared to take a day off of work because they're scared that it'll put their H-2A visa status in jeopardy if they do try to go seek medical treatment, or if they themselves are undocumented or a family member that they brought over here with them are undocumented. They're scared that if they go to the hospital that ICE may be there staking it out to round them up and separate them or detain them. And so, I think that what we're seeing with the CDC, and I never thought that I would have to disagree with the CDC, but with the policy I believe that you were specifically referring to, that the CDC kind of issued stating that farm workers are essential workers, and that they should continue to report to work if they are allegedly asymptomatic, even if they've been exposed to someone who does indeed have COVID-19. And Commissioner Troxler signed something the other week too, issued something, a statement that agreed with the CDC guidance and suggested that farm workers continue to show up to work. I have several issues with this. First of all, the fact that we are literally just looking at human beings as a commodity. We're thinking about the economic value that they would actually supply for the corporations. We're forgetting the fact that if you see an outbreak in one community, it is not going to be isolated or contained to just that community. These people go home, then they go to the grocery store. They're around their children or their family members who go out and go run errands or do anything else. We are never going to get rid of COVID-19 if we continue to see outbreaks, or we say, oh, it's acceptable for these people to continue to show up to work, and probably without any of the major legal protections that the rest of us would if we were showing up. We've already seen that OSHA hasn't been strong to call out these meatpacking plants for any of their labor violations since this started. And, I'm like, well, what protocols and systems are we putting in place? Like, are you going to spot check and make sure that they're actually doing the temperature checks of these employees? Even so, there's this whole idea that you don't understand that asymptomatic spread is still absolutely possible. We're treating people like commodities. And I know that my opponent actually spoke about this last week at a forum that we were a forum organized by nonpartisan organizations. He tried to act like he didn't have much control or much say over this, but I just think it's really important to drive home the point that the bulk of his donors for his campaign are indeed corporate interest, and one of his biggest donors this cycle is a man named Ronald Cameron, and Ronald Cameron lives out of state in Arkansas, and he is the CEO of Mountaire Farms, which is the 6th largest poultry processing facility in the country. And Mountaire Farms has a plant in Siler City where we saw an outbreak of COVID-19, especially amongst Latinx workers. And the day after that outbreak, that people were made aware of that outbreak, he wrote a $5,000 check to my opponent. And then another 1,000-something people that are workers at that plant that were exposed to the other workers never ended up getting tested for COVID-19. I think that's absolutely disgusting. I think that there are some major issues running rampant in the industry. I think that the way that we treat the backbone of the agricultural industry is inhumane and unacceptable, and I am committed to doing better and doing right by the people who make it possible for us to put food on our tables and clothes on our backs.
So if you were in your opponent's role at this particular moment in time, and you spoke about advocating for workers, talk about what form that would take and how you would have responded differently in this moment.
Well, first of all, at the start of this pandemic, I wouldn't have been questioning scientific and medical experts who knew better than I did. I also, unlike him, would not have pushed to be able to keep restaurants open early on when we knew that there was an issue with spread and that we couldn't contain this virus. And moreover, unlike him, I also know how to correctly wear my mask so it covers my nose and my mouth. I think that being able to defer to science, defer to experts like Secretary Mandy Cohen and her advice would have been pretty critical, especially early on at the start of this pandemic. So we could have begun to kind of control and contain some of this spread. As far as advocating for our farm workers, I would have been making sure that I was calling up and talking to all the folks that are running these meat packing plants. I would have been doing spot check visits to make sure that temperature checks were happening, that glass shields were being put up, that PPE was being distributed, that we were doing what we could to figure out how to get some sort of nurse or PA or doctor on site at some of these big plants that have over 1,000 employees, figuring out if we needed to move into shifts. There were a number of things that I think could have been done better than just saying, oh, look, there's no meat on the grocery store shelves, let's sell chicken out of the back of a truck. At the end of the day, we had to make sure that we're actually taking care of the workers because, we even saw the disruptions in the meat industry didn't get better when we didn't make smart choices early on. Instead, they just kept getting worse because every time we turned around, Smithfield or anyone else or Tyson would have to shut down for another 12 to 14 days because they'd end up having a major outbreak because they weren't doing what they were supposed to do. No one was policing or regulating this industry. No one was being a real watchdog, and not just that, a watchdog for consumers. And I think most consumers, and that's the other part of this job, you're not just the Commissioner of Agriculture, you're also the Commissioner of Agriculture and Consumer Services, is being a watchdog for consumers, making sure they're getting a high quality agricultural products, but also I think that means taking care of the labor and all the inputs that go into that system. And so, this is another thing that that Troxler should have been pushing for a very long time, is supporting small meat packing plants and allowing them to be successful. Because at these large meat packing plants, you're seeing, labor and environmental abuses left and right. You're seeing people who feel like they're too big to fail and who have access to high priced fancy legal teams that they would rather sit in litigation forever than worry about correcting their wrongdoing. Meatpacking in general, when you talk about what's happened in North Carolina, a lot of small farmers, and this would make a big difference for them, is supporting small and mid-sized meat processors would also support our small farmers and build more local and sustainable resilient systems. So whenever we have another one of these pandemics or epidemics or natural disasters, which we're absolutely going to have, and it would be naive to say otherwise, as of 2018, there were only about 4,000 of those small and mid-sized meat processors in the country. And a lot of farmers here in North Carolina, especially given this rich history, agricultural history we have of being engaged in livestock production, used to be able to drive like 20 minutes or so and you could get to your butcher. You could get to your meat processor. A lot of those places have closed up because they can't compete with these big guys, right, who are cutting corners and doing things cheaper. But that being said, a lot of farmers now have to travel an hour or 2 hours to even get to a meat processor. And if you don't have your meat handling license, even after they process your meat, you can't actually take possession back of the meat that you raised to be able to sell it and go put it into some other local food system. But when you're talking about these small meat processing plants, they're the ones who are more able to effectively and efficiently serve your communities. They are able to, tend to treat their employees better and pay them more. But right now, this all goes back to consolidation. There are only 4 major corporations in this country that control the bulk of the meat industry. They are Tyson, JBS, National Beef, and Cargill. And they control over 85% of beef in this country. And I mean, from like the babies being born through like the actual processing and getting it out to the shelf and the distribution. 85% of beef, 66% of pork, and almost 50% of poultry. So if you're wondering why things failed, if you saw disruptions early on, that's why, and these big boys who don't treat their employees right, they shouldn't be allowed to operate unchecked. We have to support small meat processors, we have to support our workers, and we have to be able to stand up and speak out against these guys who are doing things the wrong way.